It is my pleasure to introduce our second speaker, Dr. Azeem Ibrahim. Dr. Azeem Ibrahim is a research professor at the Strategic Study Institute at the U.S. Army War College and a senior fellow at the Center of Global Policy. He completed his PhD from the University of Cambridge and served as an international security fellow at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University and a World Fellow at Yale University. Over the years, he has met, advised numerous world leaders on policy development and was ranked as a top 100 global thinker by the European Social Think Tank at 2010. And as a young global leader by the World Economic Forum, Dr. Ibrahim made numerous trips to Myanmar and Bangladesh to carry out research. His book, he has written and spoken intensively on the prosecution of Rohingya in recent years. Please welcome Dr. Azeem Ibrahim. Thank you.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. First of all, let me give my sincere thanks to Brother Waqar and Brother Muhammad for organising this event. I wrote the book on the Rohingya. As my understanding, it's the only book of its kind at the moment. I made a number of trips to Myanmar and Bangladesh and to other places to research for this book. Now, one of the fundamental questions I get asked all the time is that this animosity against the Rohingya, who have been described as the most persecuted minority in the world by the United Nations, where does all of this animosity and this hatred actually come from? You know, a recent study by Harvard University indicated that 1 in 7 stateless people around the globe are of Rohingya origin. Altogether, the Rohingya population is estimated to be between 1.4 to 2 million people, with 800,000 in Myanmar. And out of those 800,000, over 140,000 are in IDP camps in some of the worst conditions in the world. But I just want to take a step back and try to explain to you very briefly where all this animosity actually comes from. And for that, we need to take a step back in history, back to World War II, when the Japanese first invaded what was at that time British Burma. Burma at that time was under the colonial control of the United Kingdom. When the Japanese invaded British Burma, the majority of the Buddhist population decided to side with the Japanese invaders, whereas the Rohingya population stayed loyal to the British colonial masters. The Buddhist population believed that the Japanese would be victorious against the Allied nations, and this would lead to swifter independence. So when 2 years later, when the war did end, in 1948, Burma became independent, and there was bad blood between the two nations, between the two people, the Rohingya and the Buddhist majority. But from 1948, for the next 15 years, there was relative peace and calm between the communities until 1962, when there was a military coup by the Chief of Staff called General Ne Win. General Ne Win, he tried to implement what he called the Burmese Road to Socialism. It was a communist manifesto to try to convert his whole country, which was an economic disaster. And so he did what most dictators actually do in a situation like that, when things go very badly wrong, is that they start to look for scapegoats. They start to look for people who they can blame for all these ill-conceived ideas. And the Rohingya minority was a minority of choice to be selected for this blame. See, the Rohingya, they look different, they have a different language, they have a different religion, so they're the perfect minority for General Ne Win and the military dictatorship to blame for all of these problems in the country. So over subsequent years, General Ne Win, he did what a lot of dictators actually do, and we've seen many examples of this in the Middle East when things start going wrong, is that they start to don the cloak of religiosity. We've seen the same thing happen with Saddam Hussein and Anwar Sadat and so on. They start becoming more religious to try to connect to the people, and this is exactly what he did. He started to fund monasteries, he started to sponsor more clerics in the Buddhist establishment. And one of the questions you get asked often is that aren't Buddhists these peaceful people who don't even step on insects? They don't even think of bad thoughts. You know, they're such pure people. But the form of Buddhism that they follow in Myanmar is not the form of Buddhism that you and I may be aware of. They do not recognize the Dalai Lama, for example. They follow what is known as Theravada Buddhism. And Theravada Buddhism believes that in order for Buddhism to thrive, all other ideologies have to be suppressed and kept in check. So the more thriving of the Buddhist identity came up, as it came up, the other identities had to be pushed down. And it's not just the Rohingya that were persecuted, all other minorities were persecuted as well, all other religious minorities. It just happens that the Rohingya were the most obvious and the largest minority. And this was followed by subsequent series of laws, including the 1982 citizenship law, which stripped all the Rohingya of their nationality and their citizenships. So this is essentially the basis, in a nutshell, of where all this animosity came from. And over the years, this attitude that the Rohingya are all foreigners that came over from Bangladesh. And now, some of the Buddhists actually, very bizarrely, they put a date to this as well. Some of them say this term Rohingya never existed in history, and they manufactured it in 1942. So they actually give a date. They manufactured it in March 1942 when they created this term Rohingya, but they're actually all illegal immigrants from Bangladesh. And one of the things I do in my book is to prove that this is a complete fabrication. One of the things I did is that I searched the Indian National Archives in New Delhi for the time when the British actually ruled Myanmar, Burma at the time. They actually were very organised. They did a census, and I have copies of those censuses and surveys in my book. Some of them date back to 1862 and some to 1799, in which the term Rohingya is actually used by the British. So this idea that this term is manufactured, that the Rohingya identity does not exist, is a complete historical fabrication. But let me fast forward to the situation today. I want to focus on what external players, such as ourselves, what we can actually do in the saga of the Rohingya. Now, one of the things that's argued very often is that there is nothing substantive that outsiders and foreigners can actually do, because this is the situation, this is a problem that's localized within the borders of a sovereign nation, and outsiders can't actually do much to impact this. And this argument sounds appealing, it's simple, but it's fundamentally wrong. I would argue that only foreigners and outside parties can actually affect change within Myanmar. It is only external pressure which is going to bring a change to the situation of the Rohingya, because the Rohingya will never be a majority in their own country. So, when somebody says that outsiders can't make a difference, I would argue that outsiders are the only ones that can make a difference. And there's three ways I believe that we can make a difference. First of all, we need to change the narrative when it comes to speaking about Myanmar. We need to change how we think about Myanmar. There is a certain public perception when you mention a number of countries. If I were to say to you, Palestine, Tibet, Kurdistan, Crimea, Syria, these are all countries that have significant problems. These are all countries that have issues that have to be resolved. What we need to do is we need to add Myanmar onto that list of countries that has problems, where issues have to be resolved. You see, all the international political capital of Myanmar is vested within the story of Aung San Suu Kyi. If you mention Burma, if you mention Myanmar to anybody, the only thing they will know is Aung San Suu Kyi. And her story is a fantastic story. It's a fantastic story. And we in the West, we have this thing called the Messiah complex. We love to have our heroes on a pedestal. We love to have our heroes untarnished. Nobody wants to hear about the shortcomings of Nelson Mandela. Nobody wants to hear about Martin Luther King and his extracurricular activities and his philandering. We like to have our heroes to be pure. We like to have them in Hollywood and movie theatres. And the story of Aung San Suu Kyi is perfect for this. Aung San Suu Kyi, the daughter of one of the founding generals of Myanmar, placed under house arrest by her father's former colleagues, Oxford-educated, Nobel Peace Prize, young, beautiful, fantastic story. Now she's out of prison, she's opening up her country to democracy, human rights, open markets to the West. This is made for Hollywood. And so this is the difficulty that we have, is that the story of Aung San Suu Kyi is so powerful. But we as activists, as outsiders, have to turn up the volume on the darker sides of Myanmar, on the religious discrimination, on the violence, on the massacres. And even the news in 2015, in the spring of 2015, when there was a huge refugee crisis and all these Rohingya were stuck in boats in the ocean, even that was portrayed in the media as a Southeast Asian migration crisis, and the origins of the crisis, the root cause, was never articulated. And this is where external players are best to make a change, to make influence. Journalists, photographers, newspaper editors, academics, campaigners can all learn from the cultural power that rests in national movements. Today, the majority of people consume their news. The majority of people now consume their news through social media, through Twitter, Facebook, and other apparatuses. Now, the problem with these social media is that it reinforces what you want to see and what you want to hear. If you're constantly reading news about Hollywood and celebrities and everything else, then that will be pushed up. They have these sophisticated algorithms to make sure that that is a news that's pushed up within your feed, whereas all other news is pushed down. If you're always reading about Hollywood and the latest movies and so on, you're not going to hear about the massacre in South Sudan or the problems in East Timor, because the algorithm knows that's not what you're interested in. They'll push news to you, which is what you're interested in. They'll filter out any other issue. And this is the danger, is that this issue of the Rohingya is only familiar to a very small number of elites, and it simply does not penetrate further. But there's things that we can do. Last year, for example, the government of Myanmar made a complaint to the US Embassy not to use the word Rohingya because they believed it was a manufactured term. There is no better illustration of how sensitive and weak the government is, that they're scared of foreigners of using this term. And of course, what this means is that we have to use this term even more. We have to use this term as much as we possibly can until it penetrates into the international conscience. For example, there was a story of a Rohingya football club that was playing in Kuala Lumpur. What I would like to see is this same football club touring all over Europe, playing matches with different clubs in Europe. And this story would actually write itself. The government against the footballers. This is the kind of thing we need to see. In November last year, Al Jazeera also ran a story about this Buddhist rock band, where some members of the rock band were actually of Rohingya origin, and they were inspired by the injustices in their country. There were some US NGOs, for example, there was one called Turning Tables that was working with them, and this once again is a fantastic story of a rock band that's touring around the globe, that's explaining the plight of the Rohingya people. The second thing we should do is that we need to move the debate from mentioning to petitioning. From mentioning and talking about the Rohingya issue to petitioning our politicians and leaders. And the language has hardened recently, and it was fantastic that a couple of years ago both Prime Minister David Cameron and President Obama, along with the Dalai Lama and the Pope and the UN Secretary General, mentioned the issue of the Rohingya, but it still did not go far enough. They must go from mentioning, petitioning to condemning what's actually happening. We must petition national politicians and within Myanmar itself that the Rohingya are citizens of the country and they deserve to have a right And this is a United Nations obligation. It's actually illegal for any country to strip their people of their citizenship. It's against international law, which the government of Myanmar has done. And this is a story that has to be publicised, that this is a country that is denying us citizenship to a significant proportion of its population. And this is how you chip away at the story of Aung San Suu Kyi and the political capital that she has accumulated. I was very impressed that the ASEAN countries, the group of Southeast Asian countries, who have a very strict policy of non-interference into the affairs of its members, that they have put the Rohingya issue as a permanent item on their agenda. It's simply because that these countries, the ASEAN countries, Malaysia, Thailand, Cambodia, simply cannot absorb the number of refugees, the number of Rohingyas that are fleeing their country. And the ASEAN demand is very simple, that they have to let international observers into the Rakhine state to observe. Now, very recently, just in the last couple of days, Aung San Suu Kyi's government has said that they will not permit UN observers into Myanmar. They will not give them visas, which is very ironic considering how reliant Aung San Suu Kyi was on the United Nations when she was under house arrest, when the UN was lobbying for her. And the third thing we can do is to utilise the International Criminal Court. It's very clear that the prosecutors of the International Criminal Court, along with the 6 judges in the pre-trial chamber, have a very powerful job to do here. The prosecutors can initiate an investigation and the pre-trial chamber can authorise it. And this effort has to focus on those people that are instigating the violence. Individuals, one of the questions I asked almost everybody when I was on the ground in Myanmar is, who is behind this violence? Who's instigating the violence? Who's rounding up the crowds? And there was one name that came up constantly, and that was Dr. A. Mong, the leader of the Arakan National Party. And I wrote a very long article on this in Huffington Post, which you can check. So the thing is that the job that we as external individuals, as external actors have, is a moral duty. All the evidence shows, if you examine genocides and persecution, all the evidence shows that when all the political constraints against mass killing are gone, when all the internal political constraints in the country of mass killing has gone, the only one check on genocide, on a full-scale genocide, is usually international public opinion. And we don't want to be in a situation in the future in which we say to ourselves, yes, what's happening in Myanmar, we should have acted much sooner. Thank you so much for listening.